The oldest tattooing tool ever found doesn't look like much. It's a cactus spine, blackened at the tip, bound tightly to a small handle made from a skunk's upper leg bone. It was recovered from a site in Utah, carbon dated to somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years old, and it fits so naturally in the hand that when researchers first held it, they said it felt purpose-built, like something designed by someone who had been doing this for a very long time and had worked out exactly what the job required. That tool is sitting in a museum now, and it raises a question that almost nobody thinks to ask, because the answer feels obvious until you actually look at it. When did humans first start marking their own skin permanently? Not painting it, not scarring it in ritual, but tattooing, pushing pigment beneath the surface, so it stays there through seasons and years, and the slow erasure of time. The obvious answer is Egypt. Everyone knows about Egyptian tattoos, or maybe ancient Rome, or the tribes of Polynesia that European sailors encountered and then appropriated the very word from tattoo, pressed into English, and carried back across the ocean. These answers feel right. They have the texture of settled history. They are also, it turns out, off by tens of thousands of years. The real answer sits in a cold mountain pass in the Alps, stitched into the skin of a man who was alive when the wheel hadn't been invented yet. And once you understand what was found on his body, and then follow the evidence backward from there, the picture that emerges is not the story of a practice that humans invented. It's the story of a practice so old, so widespread, and so deeply embedded in human behavior across every continent that the better question might be, was there ever a time when we didn't do this? If this is already landing, subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. In September 1991, two German hikers named Helmut and Erika Simon were making their way through a high ridge on the Austrian-Italian border when they spotted something dark and leathery protruding from the melting glacial ice below them. They assumed it was a climber who had fallen. They were not wrong, exactly. But the fall had happened 5,300 years ago. The man preserved in that ice is known now as Ötzi. He was approximately 45 years old when he died, shot through the shoulder with an arrow, and left in a place cold and dry enough to preserve him almost perfectly across 5 millennia. Researchers have spent decades examining every detail of his body. His stomach contents, his copper axe, the parasites in his intestines, the pollen trapped in his clothing, and have extracted from him an extraordinary amount of specific information about life in Copper Age Europe. But the detail that matters here is this. Ötzi had 61 tattoos. Not painted, not scarred. Tattooed. Carbon-based pigment, almost certainly soot, pushed beneath the skin in a series of lines and crosses and grouped marks that are still visible today, more than 5,000 years after they were made. Researchers examining their placement found something striking. The tattoos aren't decorative. They don't appear on visible or ceremonially significant parts of the body. They cluster instead on the lower back, the knees, the ankles, the wrists. Precisely the joints and areas where X-rays later revealed Ötzi had significant degenerative joint disease and what appears to be arthritis. The marks sit directly over the damage. There is no consensus on exactly what this means, but the leading interpretation, supported by comparisons to traditional therapeutic tattooing practices documented in several later cultures including Siberian shamanic traditions and some indigenous North American groups, is that at least some of Ötzi's tattoos were medical. Pain management. Placed where the body hurt, for a reason that had more to do with relief than display. This is already a different story than the one most people carry. A 5,300-year-old Copper Age man, tattooed not to signal identity or status or beauty, but possibly to treat his own chronic pain. The practice older than writing, older than bronze. Already, in Ötzi, sophisticated enough to be applied therapeutically, which means it had already been around long enough to have developed a purpose beyond the first obvious one. But here is the thing about Ötzi. He is not the beginning. He is the oldest confirmed tattooed human body we have found so far. Those are two very different things. To understand how old tattooing might actually be, you have to understand the problem with preserving evidence of it. Tattoos live in skin. Skin decomposes. In almost every burial environment, soil, water, exposed surface, skin is the first thing to go. Long before bone, long before stone tools, long before the pottery shards and animal remains that form the basis of most prehistoric archaeology. The only reason Ötzi's tattoos survived is that his body was mummified by cold and ice within days of his death, sealing his skin before decomposition could begin. This means the archaeological record for tattooing has a fundamental gap built into it. Every tattooed body that was buried in warm ground, or exposed to the elements, or cremated, which was common across multiple prehistoric cultures, left no trace of its markings. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is, in this case, the entirely predictable result of asking soft tissue to survive conditions that reliably destroy it. So researchers trying to establish when tattooing began have to work sideways. They look not for skin but for tools, for the pigments and implements that would have been used to make marks that no longer exist, on bodies that no longer exist. And here is where the timeline shifts dramatically. Sharp-pointed implements associated with pigment staining have been found at archaeological sites dating back well over 10,000 years across multiple continents. Ochre, iron oxide, red or yellow, the most commonly used pigment in prehistoric art and body marking, appears in human sites going back more than 100,000 years in Africa. The famous ochre processing kits found at Blombos Cave in South Africa, dated to approximately 100,000 years ago, show that early Homo sapiens were deliberately preparing pigment, grinding it, mixing it with other materials, storing it in abalone shells. They were doing something with it. Whether that something included permanent skin marking cannot be confirmed from those tools alone. But the capacity was there. What researchers can say with more confidence is this. By the time modern humans were painting cave walls, the Chauvet cave paintings in France date to approximately 36,000 years ago. They already possessed everything technically required to tattoo. They had sharp stone implements capable of puncturing skin. They had carbon-based and ochre-based pigments that, when introduced beneath the skin, would bond with tissue and remain visible. They had the manual precision demonstrated by the cave paintings themselves, which required controlled, deliberate fine motor application of pigment to a surface. The only question is whether they chose to apply that same logic to each other's bodies. And the answer, based on everything discovered since Otzi, appears to be yes, and earlier than anyone initially expected. In 2018, researchers working with collections at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology announced a finding that shifted the technical understanding of how Otzi's tattoos were made. Using high-resolution imaging on the skin itself, they determined that the marks were not made by cutting and rubbing pigment into wounds, a method used in some later tattooing traditions, but by pricking. Repeated, controlled punctures of the skin with a sharp point, driving carbon pigment downward into the dermis. The same basic mechanical principle behind every tattoo needle operating today. This technique had been independently developed, based on archaeological and ethnographic evidence, in at least several separate geographic regions, with no apparent contact between them. Indigenous Amazonian groups, documented by early European explorers, were tattooing by puncture. Inuit communities across the Arctic were tattooing, using a technique called skin stitching, drawing a needle threaded with sinew coated in soot through the upper layers of skin in continuous lines. The Maori of New Zealand developed a variant using a chisel-like instrument to carve grooves into the skin, particularly the face, then fill those grooves with pigment. The Mentawai people of the Siberut Islands in Indonesia were tattooing with thorns. The Japanese were tattooing. The ancient Britons, Julius Caesar wrote about it, were marking their bodies with a blue dye derived from the woad plant, though whether those marks were permanent tattoos or body paint remains debated. This spread matters. When a behavior appears independently across cultures with no shared history or contact, it tells you something about the behavior itself. It is not a cultural export. It is not something that spread along trade routes from a single point of origin. It is something that humans, given the right materials and enough time together, tend to arrive at on their own. The question researchers ask when they see this pattern is, what is being served? What need does this behavior meet that is universal enough to produce it independently, across oceans, across climates, across radically different social structures? The answer isn't one thing. It never is with something this old and this widespread. It is several things simultaneously, each one illuminating a different piece of what it means to be the kind of animal that decides, deliberately, to make a permanent mark on its own body. The first and most documented function of tattooing across prehistoric and early historic cultures is identity. Not personal identity in the modern sense, not self-expression, but categorical identity, group membership, the mark that tells you, and everyone who sees you, which people you belong to. This function appears so consistently across cultures and time periods that some researchers argue it may have been the original driver of the practice. The logic is straightforward, and it maps onto what we know about early human social organization. Hunter-gatherer bands typically numbered between 20 and 50 people. They operated within broader networks of related and allied bands across territories that might span hundreds of square miles. Encounters with strangers, people from outside your immediate group, carried genuine risk. You needed, quickly, a way to read who someone was before you could safely interact with them. A tattoo does this at the speed of sight. It requires no shared language. It cannot be faked with the same ease as clothing or decoration that can be removed. It is on the body, in the skin, and it says something that cannot be quickly undone. The anthropologist W.D. Hambley, in his extensive 1925 survey of tattooing across cultures, documented this identity function appearing in indigenous groups across Polynesia, North America, Southeast Asia, and Africa, groups with no connection to each other, all using permanent body marking as a primary system of social classification. The specific marks differed completely. The function was the same. Some researchers extend this logic further and suggest that tattooing as group identification may have become particularly important in a specific moment in human prehistory, the period roughly 40,000 to 12,000 years ago, when modern humans were expanding rapidly into new territories, encountering not just other bands of their own kind, but in some regions the last populations of Neanderthals, and navigating increasingly complex multi-group social landscapes. In an environment where knowing quickly whether an approaching stranger was kin or threat could determine whether you survived the next 10 minutes, a permanent, instantly visible signal of group membership would have had real survival value. This is a hypothesis, not a confirmed finding. The skin doesn't survive to tell us. But the logic is consistent with what we know about human social behavior under pressure, and it's consistent with the timing of the tools and pigments that begin appearing with greater frequency in the archaeological record during this same period. If this video is giving you something to think about, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep making content like this. The second function, and the one that generates the most genuine debate among researchers, is the one suggested by Ötzi's placement pattern, medicine. This is harder to prove than identity, but the evidence across multiple cultures is more consistent than you might expect. The Japanese practice of irazumi, in its earliest documented forms, included marks applied to specific body locations for protective and therapeutic purposes. Traditional Siberian tattooing, studied by ethnographers working with living indigenous communities in the 19th and 20th centuries, included marks placed over painful joints and areas of chronic inflammation that practitioners described explicitly as treatments. Among some indigenous groups in the American Southwest, tattooing around the mouth and chin was associated with protection against illness, a function that sounds purely symbolic until you consider that the chin and lower face are areas frequently affected by the cold sores and mouth infections that would have been endemic in close-quartered band societies. The convergence here is not conclusive, but it's enough that when researchers found Ötzi's tattoos clustered over his arthritic joints, they didn't dismiss the therapeutic interpretation as wishful thinking. They found it consistent with a pattern that keeps appearing in cultures that had no contact with each other. What makes this particularly interesting biologically is that some of the placement sites correspond to points used in acupuncture, a system of therapeutic puncture developed in China, documented in texts going back approximately 2,000 years, but which some researchers now believe has roots in much older folk practices involving marked and punctured skin. Whether there is a genuine functional connection between tattooing over a painful area and pain relief, through placebo, through minor nerve disruption, through some other mechanism, is something researchers are still actively examining. The honest position is that we don't fully know, but the practice of placing marks at the site of physical complaint appears independently enough and early enough that dismissing it as coincidence requires more work than accepting it as a real pattern. The third function is the one that gets the most popular attention and is probably the most complex to untangle: status and achievement. In multiple Polynesian cultures, tattooing was a system of recording. The marks on a person's body told you, in a visual language readable by anyone who knew the code, what that person had done, who they had defeated, what rank they held, which family they came from, how many significant events in their life had left permanent marks. Literally. A highly tattooed individual in traditional Maori society was not simply decorated. They were legible. Their body was a document. This recording function, the tattoo as a physical archive of a life, appears in enough separate traditions that it seems to represent something genuinely deep about what humans do when they develop a practice of permanent marking. The specific content varies. The impulse to make the body a record of something that happened, something earned, something survived, appears again and again. There is an archaeological dimension to this worth pausing on. Among several mummified bodies recovered from the permafrost of the Altai region in Siberia, the Pazyryk culture, dating from roughly 500 BCE to 200 BCE, researchers found extraordinarily elaborate tattooing. The most famous of these, a woman known as the Ukok princess, discovered in 1993, had tattoos covering her left shoulder and arm in flowing, intricate designs featuring deer, a capricorn, and a snow leopard. The complexity and quality of the work required a skilled practitioner, not someone applying basic marks, but someone who had developed a sophisticated visual language. The Ukok princess was buried with 6 horses and what appears to be an elaborate mortuary ritual. The tattooing was part of a system that communicated something specific about who she was. These Siberian tattoos were made approximately 2,500 years ago. Ötzi's were made 5,300 years ago. The cactus spine tool from Utah was somewhere in between. And the pigment processing kits from Blombos Cave in South Africa are 100,000 years old. The line between these points is not straight or simple, but it runs in one direction, backward, further than the popular imagination places it, deeper into human prehistory than Egypt, deeper than bronze, deeper than the wheel, which raises the question that changes how you understand the entire history of the practice. Here is what the evidence actually asks you to consider. Tattooing does not appear in the human record as an invention. It appears as a convergence. Separate peoples on separate continents, arriving at the same answer through completely independent paths, across tens of thousands of years, without any shared origin point connecting them. That pattern, when it appears in human behavior, is not accidental. It means the behavior is meeting a need so fundamental that humans reliably produce it without being taught to. Language works this way. Music works this way. The burial of the dead works this way. And tattooing, it turns out, works this way too. What need? Not one. Several, layered on top of each other across different cultures and different moments in human history. Identity, medicine, record, rite of passage. The permanent marking of a body that has survived something, done something, crossed some threshold that deserves to be remembered in a medium that doesn't wash off. The anthropologist Joanna Ostapkovich, writing on the subject of prehistoric marking practices, described tattooing as one of the few human behaviors that turns the body itself into an object of culture. Not an object that carries culture the way clothing does, removed at night and replaced in the morning. The body as the artifact. Permanent, portable, inseparable from the person who wears it. This is different from almost everything else humans do to signal who they are. And it may explain why the practice kept appearing independently, everywhere, in every climate, across every level of social complexity, from small hunter-gatherer bands to complex hierarchical states. It solves a problem that all humans share, the problem of making something that happened to you, or something you belong to, or something you have become, visible in a form that cannot be easily taken away. Ötzi carried his arthritis in his joints, and his response to it in his skin. The Ukok princess carried her status and her iconography on her shoulder. The cactus spine tool from Utah was used by someone who had worked out, through practice, exactly the right angle and pressure and rhythm to drive pigment cleanly beneath the surface without excessive damage to the tissue. These are not primitive experiments. These are refined techniques, applied by skilled hands for reasons that made complete sense within the world each of these people inhabited. The picture that emerges is not of a practice that humans invented at one point in history and then spread around the world. It is of a practice that humans keep inventing, because the underlying impulse, to make something permanent on the body, to mark a threshold or a belonging or a pain, keeps arising from conditions that are universal to human life. Now look at what happened when European sailors made contact with Polynesian cultures in the 18th century. They encountered tattooing so elaborate, so technically sophisticated, so deeply integrated into social and spiritual life that many of them came home with marks of their own. The word itself traveled back in their ships, tatau, pressed into English, carried into every language that borrowed the English version. The sailors thought they were discovering something. They were finding an extreme development of something their own ancestors had been doing for thousands of years before the practice faded from Northern European cultures during the spread of Christianity, which in many regions actively suppressed body marking as a pagan practice, incompatible with the doctrine that the body was sacred and should not be permanently altered. This suppression is its own story. The fact that tattooing largely disappeared from European practice for more than 1,000 years, then returned through maritime contact with Pacific cultures, then spread again globally through the 20th century, shows how a behavior this deeply rooted can still be interrupted by powerful institutional pressure. It does not disappear from human nature. It waits. Within 2 generations of those first Pacific voyages, tattooing was present in every major European port city. Within a century, it had spread back across the continent. Within 2 centuries, it had become one of the most common forms of permanent body modification on Earth, practiced by an estimated 500 million people as of recent survey data. The resurgence wasn't a trend, it was a return. Go back to that cactus spine tool in Utah. Black-tipped, bound to its handle of skunk bone, fitting the hand in a way that suggests long refinement. Someone made that tool. Someone used it, repeatedly, on living skin. Someone in a community where this practice had accumulated enough knowledge and enough tradition to produce a dedicated, purpose-designed instrument. That tool is between 1,000 and 2,000 years old. It sits in a museum now alongside ochre-stained stones from 100,000 years earlier and beside photographs of Otzi's skin taken with multispectral imaging that reveals marks invisible to the naked eye. These objects are not curiosities. They are the physical record of a behavior so old it predates every major human institution. Older than agriculture, older than cities, older than writing, older than religion as an organized system. The first tattoo was made in skin that is long gone, by hands we will never identify. For a reason we can only infer from the patterns that keep repeating across every culture that came after. But the impulse behind it, to take something real, something that happened or something you belong to, and press it into the body in a form that lasts, that impulse has never stopped. The cactus spine made a mark. The mark stayed. And in one form or another, across every human culture we have ever studied, someone has always picked up the tool and done it again. Thank you for watching. More videos are on your screen now. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.